The interpretation of the term gender has evolved over time and adapted in response to feminist writing and gender theory, from early notions of biological determinism to the formation of a sharp sex-gender distinction, leading to the dissolution of this distinction and the pervasiveness of heteronormativity. Gender and associated issues of sexuality and gender identity remain highly contested, complex ideas. Considering gender in development project design and implementation is increasingly important, as gender equality and female empowerment have become mainstream priorities. The complexity and pervasiveness of gender is not adequately understood, and this is demonstrated through the largely heteronormative nature of gender and development efforts. Development NGOs have reinforced this through paying insufficient attention to sexual and gender minorities and by upholding a disempowering narrative of female victimization. Countering heteronormativity and facilitating a deeper appreciation of gender requires development NGOs to pay closer attention to the important ideas presented through intersectionality. It is important to consider the changing understanding of gender to better appreciate its complexity and the present challenge to reconcile a vast body of theory into the work of development NGOs. Biological determinism was driven by associating gender with biology and established the binary approach to gender theory. This idea conflated sex and gender, claiming female biology to be inferior and rendered women's participation in political, economic, and social decision-making as inappropriate. A biological approach to gender served a systemic process of subordination, which positioned men as naturally superior and institutionalized gender inequality and female exclusion. Early feminist writing challenged the idea of biological determinism by drawing a distinction between sex and gender. Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex is credited for paving the way for the formation of a sex-gender distinction when she wrote, "One is not born, but rather becomes a woman." This distinction holds that sex refers to an individual's biological makeup as female or male, while gender is a socially constructed phenomenon defining what it means to be a woman or a man. Feminists adopted this position to challenge suggestions that one's opportunities should be biologically determined, and that gendering labour activities and social roles suppress the biological similarities of men and women. Gail Rubin was a key figure in this space, highlighting biological similarity and developing the sex-gender system to define sex as fixed biological differences and gender the result of socially defined imaginings. Understanding gender as a set of socially constructed norms opened the possibility of changing this narrative. However, the complexity of this topic developed as feminist critique levelled at the sex-gender distinction and highlighted its limitations. While a sharp distinction between sex and gender was helpful in revealing the fallacy of fixed gender roles, the ongoing value of this idea has been debated. Judith Butler is a vital contributor to feminist gender theory, and her work has dissolved the sex-gender distinction while acknowledging the important role it played in subversion. Butler argues individuals do not experience their sex in the absence of gender, as we always perceive sex through the lens of gender, and therefore sex is always already gendered. In other words, the omnipresence of gender means the individual doesn't get to experience their body or sex without it having already been gendered. Butler's work has also explored the notion of intelligibility, implying adherence to gender norms makes people intelligible to one another. Butler's positioning of gender norms, which shape how we understand one another, relates to the broader reading of gender through heteronormativity. Heteronormativity can be defined as a set of principles which outline the societally condoned performance of sex, gender, and sexuality. To adhere to what is deemed socially acceptable, there is a systemic expectation of heterosexuality, awarding privilege to those behaviours that meet this norm, while ostracizing those that don't. Reflecting on Butler's contention that there is no sex without gender, heteronormativity can be understood as the force behind the amalgamation of the two. It is important not to understate the harsh consequences of deviating from society's heteronormative formation and the damaging nature of this system. Concern is then raised in the context of gender and development efforts, which seek to empower gender and sexual minorities within the confines of heteronormativity, rather than moving to subvert it. NGOs working in the Global South have been criticised for failing to demonstrate full appreciation of gender and heteronormativity, perpetuating social hierarchies of supremacy and subordination. Heteronormative readings of gender are reflected in development efforts which pursue projects shaped exclusively around women in the context of heteronuclear families. This perpetuates a largely heterosexual expectation of women and development, ignoring those who deviate from this norm. Development interventions also have a tendency to view female-headed households as characteristic of deprivation and hardship, while failing to acknowledge this may be a choice, such as for lesbian couples or women who choose to live independently. A further example is the case of a domestic violence service in Nairobi, which offered support to women experiencing harm by male partners. Understanding sexual and gender-based violence has been reduced to violence against women by their male partner, ignoring harm against independent women, lesbian women, gay men, and other sexual and gender minorities. The development sector seems to have stalled at a largely binary understanding of a sex-gender distinction, failing to take into account the harmful heteronormative nature of this system. Considering female sexuality more specifically, gender and development efforts in the Global South have been criticised for framing this issue through a lens of violence, threat, disease, and unfreedoms. This adheres to a heteronormative rendering of women as passive, submissive victims reduced to a subordinate position in society. Women are not presented with a story of sexual empowerment, where their right to desire pleasure and engage in consensual and enjoyable sex is upheld with equal importance. While the violence women experience should never be understated, perpetuating this as a single story challenges the important role sexuality can play in female empowerment. While it could be argued this decision to ignore female sexuality in gender and development is driven by cultural sensitivity and local government claims of a Western ideological intervention, counter-argument holds that a similar critique isn't made in projects targeting wealth and class inequality. Accepting this criticism suggests development efforts may reinforce local systems of heteronormativity, undermining the long-term achievement of equality for sexual and gender minorities. Given the established critique of development NGOs failing to demonstrate a full understanding of the complexity of gender, a lens of intersectionality should be pursued to address this concern. Intersectionality refers to an understanding that we do not experience our identities in disjointed singularities as, for example, a woman, a person of colour, a transgender individual. Rather, these identities intersect, and our experiences are shaped by the interdependence of these attributes, making the aforementioned identity better embodied as a transgender woman of colour. Applying an appreciation for intersectionality to gender and development will shift the tendency to focus only on the treatment of individual characteristics, and will encourage deeper consideration of the way race, sexuality, gender identity, history, and culture converge and compound discrimination. Given the harm heteronormativity can reinforce around social identities, development NGOs must understand gender in this context and more specifically how this impacts sexual and gender minorities. By applying an intersectional lens in the context of all development interventions, NGOs will be better positioned to ensure their work is addressing a deeper reading of gender and its complexities. By maintaining a heteronormative understanding of feminist theory, gender, sexuality, and identity, NGOs are excluding gender and sexually diverse communities. To this extent, NGOs don't get gender, as there is a current failure to fully appreciate and uphold the diversity championed through this concept. An acknowledgement of sexuality beyond heterosexuality, and a discussion of sexuality which isn't defined by a discourse of negativity could prove to be powerful acts of subversion. This challenges the narrative of heteronormativity which locks women and other minorities into a single story of weakness and victimization, inhibiting their potential for empowerment. Through an appreciation of intersectionality, gender and development can move beyond the binary sex-gender distinction of early feminist critique and take a more holistic approach. While the understanding of sex and gender offered through the works of Judith Butler present a more complex narrative for development NGOs, they are most successful at revealing the broader systemic issue of heteronormativity, which is currently, and largely inadvertently, reinforced in development practice.